We're talking Cincinnati Bengals on the Our Football Network, Our Football YouTube channel. And that means it's time to turn our attention to our Bengals insider, John Sheeran. Of course, John is with A to Z Sports at A2ZSports.com. John, thanks for doing this again.
Yeah, it's good to be back, Greg. How are you?
I'm doing good. It's a fun time of year. Of course, it'd be a lot funner if our teams were in the playoffs and still striving for a Super Bowl title. But that's the fun thing about the NFL is that even when the season's over, there's always cool stuff to follow. And that's why I like having these discussions, because we get, the season's over. Now we got to kind of reset, or at least I do. And have really informative guys like you on that could help me to educate what's going on with these specific teams like the Cincinnati Bengals. And it's a very, very strange year for your team this season, John. That's probably an understatement. They almost made it in. It almost happened, but what would you say as far as the take from this season? Like, what is just the big storyline, the headline? Would it be the defense being so bad?
100%. I think you go back to when Joe Burrow was first coming up, and obviously, the LSU Louisiana connection, but his favorite quarterback growing up was Drew Brees. That's why he wore the number 9. And obviously, Drew Brees had a season like Joe Burrow just had, I think, like 8 times in his career, where he led the NFL in passing, and the Saints were like 8-8, 7-9 because their defense was terrible, right? It was never the offense's fault as to why those Saints at the 2010s couldn't really get back to the Super Bowl. It was a lot like what we saw with the Bengals this year. And it was around October where the defense started to find itself a little bit, because they were playing the likes of the Giants and the Browns and the Raiders. So there was hope that, just like in years past, you take that mid-season, they're around 500, but they can, reel off some wins here to get back in the playoff race. And then once November hit and they lost to the Steelers, the Chargers, there was another team in there, the Ravens, they gave up like 30-something points in each of those games. It was basically wraps at that point. There was nothing that they could do. They won 5 games in the season, and it still wasn't enough to get back into the playoffs. So it was extremely disappointing, all things considering, with Joe Burrow playing at an MVP level, Jamar Chase winning the Triple Crown, and it just not being enough. And Trey Hendrickson leading the NFL in sacks. Like, typically, when you have 3 players playing like that, you'll end up seeing them in January, and that wasn't the case, because the totality of the defense and all of its failures over the past couple of years really built up into one calamitous failure, and that's why they had some coaching changes this month.
Yeah, matter of fact, one of those coaches has already gotten a new job. Were you surprised by that?
No, not necessarily. I think there's definitely a positive perception with Lou Anarumo around the NFL, because the Bengals defense typically played pretty well in those really important games, whether it be in prime time or the playoffs. And that's going to be Lou's legacy, and I think it's a very fair one, too. I think at the end of the day, someone who was hired as kind of like a no-name defensive coordinator back in 2019, he was the 6th or 7th candidate for the job. For him to end up where he was after all these years, it was definitely above expectation. But yeah, there was definite week-to-week inconsistencies and a disconnect between him and the younger players that just didn't get enough development, or they just didn't get enough attention, whatever the case may have been. It was just really too little too late for that defense that started to come alive at the end of the season. But I'm not surprised that he got respect from other NFL teams, and that he was a hot name with the defensive coordinator search. I think with another front office that maybe is more active in keeping his veterans, I think he'll end up doing fine. And I'm interested to see how it goes in Indianapolis, because it kind of seems like with Ballard kind of on the hot seat as a GM, they haven't made the playoffs in a while. I don't really know how all that's going to work. It kind of seems like a powder keg waiting to explode, but I hope the best for Lou.
Yeah, it might be a 1-year gig. Who knows? Okay, so let's talk about the big replacement at that position. How excited are the fans to have Al Golden in tow?
It's a mix, I think, because everyone recognizes that he was a really good linebackers coach a couple years ago with the Bengals. He was in charge of third down play calling. A lot of the blitz packages came from his mind as well. Players really respected him. They really loved playing for him. Logan Wilson, who's now the team's main linebacker, he played with him all those years ago. He really loved how simplified he kept things, and I think he meant a lot to those younger players who were coming up around that time. And when he left, there was kind of like that void that never really was filled in his spot. And I think that was one of the key factors to start why the defense kind of took a downward spiral that it kind of did. So there's a recognition that he had a lot of value with his last time in Cincinnati. But at the end of the day, he's 55 years old. He's never been a defensive coordinator at the NFL level, so there's still some unknowns there. And I think the way that the Bengals went about the search brings up slight concerns, considering the fact that they were locked in on him from the jump, and with a vacancy that's with the allure of like all this defense has to be is average, and Joe Burrow can take you far. So there's an allure of like, hey, you can get some big names here for this job potentially, who wants to be like an ascending defensive coordinator, and they kind of landed on a guy that they already knew, who was familiar with the organization. So there's a little bit of pause with the way they went about the search, but at the end of the day, Golden is someone who can connect with younger players, obviously being a defensive coordinator at the college level for the past 3 years, who can maximize personnel, and again, someone who I think has the definite respect of the players who were here during that Super Bowl run. So you kind of take the good and the bad, but at the end of the day, I think it's a good hire that checks a lot of the boxes that they were looking for.
Was there, I mean, you're talking about some other coaches. Was I talking to Robert Salehs of the world? Like, why didn't they interview these guys? Is that what you're saying? Was there anyone else?
Yeah, so there was 2 finalists technically, like Patrick Graham, who was in line to be potentially a candidate for the Jags head coaching spot. He was the other finalist who interviewed. He was like I think the first reported interview for this spot, and I think a lot of fans were interested with that because he had been a defensive coordinator at the NFL level, and he had he was able to maximize, I think, the poor rosters that he had to work with Vegas and the Giants and whatever. So he was the only other guy that was in the mix. And yeah, like you said, like there were some big names that they could have attracted. I was told that they talked to some guys, but just didn't bring them in for interviews. But I still think that when you have this opportunity where it's an extremely important hire, it's the second most important coach on staff because Zach Taylor runs the offense, and how calamitous that side of the ball was last year, and the reason why you weren't able to go to the playoffs. Like, you have to get this right. So I would have figured that they would have had a more extensive search in order to get the right guy, but clearly they valued Golden from the jump, and this was the guy that they wanted all along. So we'll see if it works out.
Yeah, because I mean, you just think like, if you hire a guy like Robert Saleh, like you just know, oh, our defense is going to be great. Maybe not this year, but in the next couple of years, and we got the offense, and then we could. Not that he might be here very long, but so I can see the fans maybe feeling whether it's a Saleh or someone else. And this is a little bit more of a crapshoot hire, but still, hey, you know what? He's coming off a really impressive season with Notre Dame. They had an amazing run, mainly because of their defense more than anything. So hey, he deserves it. And like you said, he's a former Bengal coach as well. And maybe this will be a perfect fit. Okay. Any other key coaching hires?
So they hired Scott Peters to be their offensive line coach, and reportedly Jerry Montgomery is going to be their defensive line coach. Peters was a former assistant under Bill Callahan with the Cleveland Browns, and he took over the Patriots offensive line last year. So most recent example of his results are obviously not promising because the Patriots offensive line was a complete mess with injuries and everything like that. So it's hard to put it all on him. But this guy was kind of known for being an individual coach for offensive linemen and really renowned for his ways of teaching pass protection. So not a very traditional background for an up-and-coming offensive line team-wide coach, but an interesting hire nonetheless. I think he's a lot different than the guy that they're replacing in Frank Pollock. And Montgomery, he was with the Packers for many years with Mike Daniels and Kenny Clark and some of those guys who developed really well over there. And then he got his most recent job also with the Patriots. So 2 former assistants for the 2024 terrible New England Patriots are now Bengals coaches, which again gives you a little bit of pause, but I think their overall resumes are pretty strong and promising, I think, for their new roles now.
Yeah, your career, what you do for the longevity, is definitely a lot more important than a one-year gig or a one-year season with New England. Before we get started, I just want to remind everybody, one of the main reasons that we are interviewing John, again, as I said at the open, is to get as much information as possible. The Bengals are one of the teams that I put a report in for the yearly Ourlads draft guide, which is available, of course, at ourlads.com. I have a link in the description. You can check it out. And this is the best draft guide on the market, so you want to check it out. And once again, there are 32 team write-ups as well. I'm in charge of, I don't know, something like 10 or something like that. And the Bengals are one of them. So that's why John has been a very faithful advisor for me these several years, and hopefully several more. All right, so let's get into free agency. All right, so let me see what we got here. First of all, cap situation is okay as normal. This is the Bengals. And I'm looking over at free agency. So yes, we got to start obviously with T. Higgins, and I don't think conversation is going to last long because we've talked about this several times. T. Higgins is not going to be with the Cincinnati Bengals. Nothing has changed, correct?
I was surprised you said that. I think it's more likely that he's a Bengal in 2025 than not. Yes, because I think some things have happened over the past couple of months here.
Okay.
T. Higgins' agent was David Mulligetta of Athletes First, the guy who's known for getting the best possible free agent contracts out there. He was the main disconnect between the Bengals and T for the past couple of years. And that's why we've talked about this ad nauseum, right? There's always been, like, they weren't able to come together. That's why they tagged him in the first place. And, like, it's kind of been a mess. So he let go of Mulligetta sometime this past season, and then it was reported in December that he now has the same agent as Jamar Chase. So as Jamar Chase is going to negotiate for an extension this offseason, T. Higgins is also going to try to get a contract done with the Bengals. It's where he's said that he wants to be. Joe Burrow has said numerous times now that T. Higgins is a need, he's a priority, and you can't let him get out the door. Like, he's said this to like the press and into the public. He's put it out there, and he's put the Bengals on the spot, and it's something that T wants to. It's going to be a priority for the Bengals, and I think so much to the point that if they have to tag him again as a last resort, I think it will come to that because, like you said, they do have the cap room. They're going to have more cap space with some roster cuts that we'll get to in a minute, but I would expect T. Higgins to be a Bengal for at least, at minimum, one more season.
Well, that's great to hear because as a fan, you really enjoy watching the Cincinnati Bengals offense run. You just have to. I mean, it's just awesome to see. And without Higgins, who knows what would happen there. So that's really good to know. I know a lot of the times when we were talking, it was like, no, he's gone. Right. But like you said, he's changed agents, and that's all you need sometimes. And so that's a really good sign. Okay. So, and what do you think about Chase? You think he is going to get his contract extension?
Yeah, like this time last year, I would have expected the contract to come this year because it's what they did with AJ Green several years ago. Typically, like first round picks didn't normally get, like first round non-quarterbacks didn't normally get extensions after the third year, but last year was such a difference in that, like Devonta Smith, Jalen Waddle, Penei Sewell, Christian Darrisaw, like you name it, like great first round picks from that 2021 class ended up getting contracts, and the Bengals wanted to follow suit with that, but for whatever reason, they couldn't get across the goal line, and it was completely inexcusable, a complete fumble on their part, because now Chase is going to cost significantly more than he would have probably cost last year, but again, I mean, he's an all-pro, he's arguably the best receiver in the NFL. They would be just complete morons to let him walk, and I think they have to get him done this year for sure.
That's good. Well, he's on my dynasty team, so I'm happy to hear that. All right. So is Burton, by the way. So I'm definitely, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Receivers are fickle. Rookie receivers are fickle. They can have a bad one or really bad rookie season and then turn things around. But you don't sound promised. That wasn't a promising remark.
Well, I don't know if you're aware of his legal issues at the moment. He was kind of involved with an investigation with a potential assault that happened a couple months ago, or maybe it was last month. It's why he didn't travel for the team's last game of the season because he was dealing with that. He apparently got evicted from his apartment building because of damage. Again, it's a lot of speculation and allegations at the moment, so there's nothing concrete. But a lot of the concerns that teams had with him last year was why they didn't have him on their board, except maybe the Bengals were one of the only teams. A lot of those concerns are looking to be very valid at the moment.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's another conversation that we're going to have in a few minutes. All right, let's go through the rest of this board here because there's some other key players that need to be signed. Let's stay on offense. What about Gesicki? Because he had a really good year.
Right. I think he's obviously lower on the pecking order than T in that regard, but I think he's interesting because like Hayden Hurst and CJ Uzomah were past Bengals tight ends that were allowed to hit the free agency market, and they got the best possible deals that they were looking for. It didn't work out for either of them, unfortunately, and I think that's something that Gesicki should be aware of. Like, if you leave Joe Burrow and go to maybe a more struggling team with a lesser quarterback, there's not a guarantee that you're going to see all that money. So I'm interested to see if the Bengals are going to kind of meet him halfway here because they don't overly value the tight end position a lot in terms of just monetary value, but I think Gesicki was the best fit out of their recent free agency experiments at the position, even if he's not technically a tight end, right? He's just a big slot receiver. He rarely goes in line, and they have other guys who kind of fill that spot. So I think they recognize the value that he had, and I think he recognizes that this is probably the best place for him to be maximized. So I'm interested to see if they come to like a compromise where the Bengals don't necessarily meet the biggest deals that he gets in the market, but maybe he takes somewhat of a hometown discount in that regard.
Yeah, and how many times? I mean, I know this again, covering the team for the guide. It's like a rolling tight end room every year. It's a new number one tight end. So it would be nice if they had at least another year, because that would give Eric All and even maybe McLaughlin a little bit more time, which tight ends typically need in order to acclimate themselves into the NFL. So I'm sure that's probably the plan. You still think they have high hopes for both of those young kids?
For sure, Eric All, because he was contributing immediately as a rookie, and that was surprising considering he was coming off of a knee injury. Like, he recovered, I think, faster than people expected to, and by the middle of the season, he was arguably their number one tight end because he was used on all three downs as a blocker. He was developing as a receiver, so it was really unfortunate for him to suffer the same injury to his knee, the torn ACL, and it suffered it later in the season than he did back at Iowa. So I think he's very questionable to start the season, probably on the PUP list. So you're looking at, filling those snaps. And McLaughlin never really played this year. Like you said, like, he was always kind of a project. It's why Cam Grandy, who you see as like the number 4 tight end, he got just re-signed a couple of days ago. They really liked what he did in Eric All's absence as like kind of an inline blocker. So I think both Grandy and All are going to be part of the plans this year, but it's a matter of whenever All gets back, which might not be until, middle of the season.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, another reason to bring Gesicki back, that's for sure. All right. Let's see. Sticking on offensive line, we have Brown and Ford. Ford did not have a good year, so does that mean he could walk? And I know Volson didn't look very good, so we're going to get into team needs in a little bit. I'm assuming guard is going to be pretty big on the list. But also Brown. What's the deal there? With Trent Brown? Of course, Mims is their starter. Are they just going to let both Ford and Brown walk?
I think Brown is definitely gone, just because he suffered the injury. He was only going to be here for a year anyways to let Mims kind of get up to speed, but then Mims took over and looked the part as a rookie, so they really like what they have there. With Ford, it's interesting because they were really appreciative of him filling in multiple spots. Like, he was very open to kind of going all over the offensive line, and they were comfortable enough with him to start him over Cordell Volson, who clearly just wasn't it by the end of the season. I don't think I would expect Volson to be a starter next year either. So I could see Ford back on like a minimum deal just because they appreciate and value him. But honestly, he shouldn't be starting on any offensive line. He should be a backup at best for sure.
All right. Now, one more, and that's running backs before we go to defense. So Herbert, I know he really didn't get much time at all until no one was left. So... but any guess on whether or not he'll be a nice little cheap addition to bring back?
Yeah, you might as well. I don't know what his market's going to be like as someone who was traded for a 7th-round pick at the end of his rookie deal, right? So I figure if you can get him back on the smallest deal possible, see if he's RB2 or RB3. I would imagine that they're going to be interested in looking at one in the draft, kind of in the later rounds, to fill out that room because they don't want Chase Brown doing everything. Like, it was really promising to see him fill in as a starter, but I think they want to they want to lighten his workload, I think, a little bit. And I think Herbert fits as like an RB3 for sure. Yeah,
I had Brown on my year-to-year league, and I was so happy when Moss went down. Yeah. I was like, oh, thank goodness. And I'm sure Bengals fans probably were too. It's like, let this kid play. I mean, so Moss, by the way, is he a cap casualty, or what do you think?
Yeah, he suffered a neck injury in the middle of the season. That's why he was hurt. There was reports that he could have came back, but also, you're 27, 28. The neck is like one of the most important body parts for a running back to have because you're taking on contact. So I'm interested to see, his recovery there, but he's only got one more year left here. He can be cut pretty easily, and I would imagine that's the more likely scenario than him coming back for sure.
Okay. On defense, there are a bunch of questions here. Let's start, first of all, with Mike Hilton. That's a really big one. You think they'll bring him back?
Precedent would say no, considering he's going to be 31 and it's his 3rd contract or 4th contract, whatever it is. And the fact that he has definitely taken a step back in coverage is concerning because that's the most important part for a cornerback to have. But still their best tackling cornerback part by far, still phenomenal in that niche role that he has of blitzing off the edge. So there's definite value with him, and I think he's very much appreciated in that locker room, and that's also something they consider. Like he's a leader there, and they lost a lot of leadership in recent years, so maybe that's why you value him more than other 30, 31-year-olds that you typically wouldn't bring back. So I'm on the fence with him. I think there's a better chance than not that he's gone just because of the age thing, but he still can be a starter and he can still, fill in the role that he has. They're just going to be smarter with him, taking him off the field in obvious passing downs, because he was continuing to get burned in those situations this year. And once they kind of figured out a better way of implementing other guys, I think it was a little bit better, but he's certainly not getting any younger.
All right, at safety, Von Bell, that return didn't work out, it seemed, and also, the safety room was just awful. What happened there? I mean, it's not like they didn't have players capable, but
no, it was definitely a mix between Anarumo being very reliant on Von Bell because he's a veteran and he knows what he likes to do, and the fact that Von Bell is just cooked at this point. Like, he can't move like he used to. He couldn't tackle like he used to, like he used to be able to. So once they finally had Jordan Battle, who's the second-year player out of Alabama, the former third-round pick, once he finally started playing more, and I think Lou kind of simplified things on the defensive side of the ball, once Battle is more comfortable, like, you saw a little bit of improvement there. And the same thing with Geno Stone as well. Like, he's definitely struggled early on in the season. He couldn't do the things that Anarumo wanted originally to do. So once everything was more dumbed down, like, I think Stone was playing a little bit more free and fast, and he started getting some interceptions, which is what he did in his last year at Baltimore. So they started to see the value of Stone towards the later part of the year. But now that you have a new defense coordinator in there, and Stone, he obviously wasn't good for most of the season. So he's another guy that's on the fence of being a cap casualty, but I could see him being brought back for sure.
And Taylor Britt, we talked about him the last time we had a conversation before the run at the end of the year, as he was struggling a lot. He seemed to pick things up a little bit.
Same situation. It really was for the entire secondary. Like, they were still not on the same page. There were still a lot of miscommunications, and that's why the defense was bad for most of the year. But once everything started to be more dumbed down and simplified, they were playing a little bit more loose and fast, and I think that's why Taylor Britt also saw that kind of a jump. So he still has, I believe he's entering now a contract year, and he's definitely not worthy of like a huge extension by any means as of now, but I think they'll still want to see what he can do in a contract year for sure.
And this is why when we had the conversation, it was like, this was at the bye week. It was like, well, you got to try something. I mean, something you have to. And so that's one that I'll remember. Hey, you have to try something like dumbing down the defense. So, cause that worked. And so that good approach. And again, probably a good reason why you said at the very beginning, why he still has a job somewhere. Okay. Up front, BJ Hill, good player. Will he be back?
I would say no. I think they want a pretty much a restart as much as possible along the defensive line. Outside of, obviously, you want to keep Trey Hendrickson for as long as possible. And he's like the biggest. I know we were talking about the Hill, but just real quick, I think with Hendrickson, he's entering a contract year. I wouldn't be surprised if they approach him for an extension too. But with Hill, going to be 31 as well. Has never really been that great of a pass rusher. Like, that wasn't really where his value was, but he became their best interior pass rusher kind of by necessity because they didn't really have anyone else. Like, Sheldon Rankins was a complete failure this year, and unfortunately he suffered some type of an illness that he ended up missing most of the season with. But I would say with Hill, they want to get younger and more explosive and just better at rushing the passer at that spot for sure.
Okay, so before we get into some cuts, Asai, that just hasn't ever worked out. Do you think they're just going to let him go? And Davis Gaither as well?
I think with both of those guys, they'll probably find better offers elsewhere. I think with Asai, like you said, it was always a matter of, like, he was not in the doghouse necessarily, but I don't think he earned the full trust of Anarumo and the other coaches that he was under. So if I were him, I would be looking at a place where I can be a starter, because he definitely started to play a little bit better as the season went on, and I think that kind of helped his value. And with Davis Gaither, I think he also switched agents. I think he switched to David Mulligetta very recently in Athletes First, so he's kind of looking for a little bit more than I think what the Bengals are going to offer.
How is the capital for the Bengals, draft capital?
They have 6 picks because they traded 1 for Herbert.
Okay, so basically top 6?
Top 6 what?
First, second, third, fourth, fifth round?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Okay, no problem. All right, here we go. Team needs. So, well, actually, before team needs, potential cap casualties. You already mentioned a few of them. What's the status of Evan McPherson? I mean, is that really becoming an issue now?
It definitely was this past year because they just extended him, and
Yeah.
he's got 3 more years on his contract. So I think they kind of just had to eat that at least for 2025. And I don't know if they're going to bring in competition necessarily, but I could see them maybe lightening his workload in training camp just to give another guy some chances to see if he can stick around on like the practice squad or maybe get an opportunity elsewhere. But no, I mean, kickers are just so like it's unpredictable. Whenever they get the yips, they get the yips. And,
Yeah.
like Justin Tucker, he sort of had to fall off this year too. But obviously McPherson's never been at Tucker's level, but you never really know when it's going to happen. And I think they just kind of made that decision to extend him, and now they just kind of have to see what 2025 has to offer. And if it's still the same thing in this next season, then there's a real conversation I think to have in 2026.
Speaking of the yips, Cade York, I'm surprised he's still even around in the NFL. I mean, this guy needs to maybe go to one of those summer leagues or something to get his head on straight, because I mean, I can imagine when he was lining up for that field goal attempt against Denver, fans must have been afraid about the possibilities, knowing Cade York's past with the Cleveland Browns and his weak misses. I'm not going to go down that road, but anyway, were you kind of nervous about that at the time when he was lining up for that little chip shot?
I think it was worse because I don't remember him missing a kick with the Bengals before that. So like he built up a false sense of confidence with the team. And then obviously it was like the shortest field goal attempt that he had. And of course he doinks it. So it was kind of like just a backstabbing almost.
Yeah. Well, he was a Brown. Okay. Team needs. So let's get to the it's up to you if you want to go like an order of the top need. We could do it after we go through all of them, but you want to start with the top need?
Top need is pass rush, whether that's a second edge to help out Trey Hendrickson or just not a full-blown rebuild of the defensive tackle group, because you're still going to have Chris Jenkins and McKinley Jackson, but you're probably looking at a new starter because Sam Hubbard is a very likely cap casualty, a new starter at 3 technique because they're probably not going to bring back BJ Hill, and you probably want a starter next in because I don't know if you want either Chris Jenkins or McKinley Jackson starting next year. I think both of those guys are perfectly fine as your 3rd or 4th guys in the rotation. I would expect multiple draft picks to be kind of thrown at this position group and at least one notable name in free agency, because if they have no pass rush outside Trey Hendrickson, the defense is not going to make any jump worth noting.
So will the right now, I mean, so do you see then Rankins maybe and Hill are probably not going to be there? Jackson and Jenkins, what you're saying is you think they'll kind of remain in their positions, but they'll try to bring in maybe a couple more veterans?
I'm saying right now, Sheldon Rankins is not a Bengal in 2025 Like,
we know that. Okay.
It was a total failure. And Hill, I would say, is not coming back.
Not coming back.
Those are your 2 starters from at least week 1 of last year. And I don't think Jenkins and Jackson showed enough where you're like totally confident in either of those guys starting. I think worst case scenario, they'll look to get a starter. And if they fail in free agency, they'll be like, oh, well, I guess we have these guys to fall back on, which is totally possible because they completely botched the DJ Reader situation. And that's why they had to rely on some of those young guys to start and everything. But no, I would expect 2 new starters at defensive tackle for sure.
Okay. So that means, are we going to go edge 1, defensive tackle 2?
I think it's 1A, 1B, honestly.
1A, 1B. Okay. Yeah. That's fine. All right. Next, what do they need?
Guards. 2 guards minimum. Alex Kappa, definite cap casualty. Suffered a knee injury a couple years ago. Hasn't been the same player. Can't start Cordell Volson again for a 4th year in a row. So that's looking like a situation where, again, you're thinking of like a mid-level free agent because they never really spend that big along the interior offensive line, and potentially a high draft pick. So they only got 6 picks at the moment. I think at least half of them are going to be in the trenches for like premium picks. So that's kind of a preview of where you're looking at this team in the draft right now.
And so right now, is Karras the only one that probably stays because they have other needs at this point?
Yeah, Karras, I think he signed an extension last year, and he was still really good in pass protection this year. So he's probably locked in to be a starter. And I wouldn't expect Volson to get cut. Maybe until like right before the season, if that's how it goes in camp. But I would expect him to stay around and compete for a backup spot.
And how's Orlando Brown?
He was great before he suffered. It was either fibula or tibia injury, and essentially he was playing on a broken knee during like the final couple weeks, and he ended up missing the most games that he's ever missed in his career. But before that happened in October, he was playing at the same level, if not above, where he was at in Kansas City. He made some changes to his technique and pass protection, and it was really paying off. He was playing like a really premier left tackle, and that's the expectation for these final 2 years that he's here.
Okay. Next need.
So let's see here. We got edge, defensive
You actually
tackle,
could have
guard.
4 right there: edge, defensive tackle, guard. But I'm gonna
Probably safety, like just to see, like, because I'm not 100% confident that Geno Stone is back, and if he's not back, then they obviously need someone else. And like Xavier Watts is the name that comes to mind because he played Notre Dame under Al Golden, and he's going to be probably like that top 50 type pick. So that's a name to watch. But yeah, like depending on what they do with Geno Stone, I would say safety, and then you can throw in linebacker in there as well because Jermaine Pratt is also kind of on the fence as a cap casualty, and if he's gone, they will need another starter there for sure.
Okay. Yeah, because actually, correct me if I'm wrong, but I noticed, statistically speaking, that they played 3 linebackers last year, a little bit more than normal.
It was half of that, and also because Wilson ended up missing a lot of times. I think Davis Gaither got some snaps in his place.
Got it. All right. And would that be it? Are those the main? Well, do you think running back is in there as well, like a late kind of 4? I mean, maybe like the 5th need or something. Or wide receiver.
I would print. That's tough because if they bring back Higgins, they can't really draft like a premium wide receiver at that point. You have your 3 starters there, but you don't really have a lot of depth, especially because you don't know what's going to happen with Burden, Charlie Jones. You can't rely on him either. So wide receiver is kind of a sneaky need along with tight end, depending on what happens with Gesicki and all for sure.
All right, cool. Are there any players that did develop well that you thought that could be able to take up? I know we've talked about a few of them already, but maybe, I don't know, maybe someone we haven't talked about, or just to emphasize that, you know what, I think this guy might be a starter here either this year or at least a really good contributor.
Yeah, I think we haven't talked about corners that much, and I think before he got hurt, he also suffered a torn ACL. Dax Hill was looking like the cornerback that they hoped he would be when they moved him to that position last year. Like he won the training camp battle against DJ Turner, and he was playing pretty well. Like obviously the standard was pretty low considering the defense was terrible at that time, but I think individually he was playing all right, and I think there's hope that he can kind of build off that. DJ Turner took his place after Dax got hurt, and he started playing pretty well, and then he suffered a season-ending injury. So I think for as much maligned as the secondary was last year, I think they're still in a decent spot at the cornerback position, especially if you can count on Taylor Britt to be who he was at the end of the season with a more simplified scheme.
And how did the draft go last year for them? Did anybody, Mims, obviously the first rounder, you seem to think that he looks like he's a keeper. You talked about all. What about any of the other rookies? And we talked about the defensive tackles. So what about any of the other rookies?
Yeah, Mims was a solid rookie starter, and I think you can expect just slowly building off of that, and totally fine for what they need. And Eric All, I think in terms of value, brought the most because he was a 4th-round pick, and you weren't sure how much he was going to do as a rookie, but he definitely had a clear, concise role within the offense, which was really impressive to see. But Chris Jenkins, I think, ended up being decent as a rotational guy. I think McKinley Jackson flashed a little bit more as a pass rusher, maybe a disruptor into the backfield, which was always kind of aligned with his scouting report too. He had more backfield production than Chris Jenkins ever had at Michigan. So I'm interested to see how he grows. But yeah, you didn't really get anything out of Burden outside of being a kickoff returner. And outside of that, like McLaughlin didn't really play. Josh Newton, I think, deserves a shout out too because he ended up starting, I think, for DJ Turner in those final 5 games, and he made some plays on the ball. So I would kind of have him be in line to be Mike Hilton's replacement in the slot. I think that's where he kind of fits better than being on the boundary, but I think there's definitely a role for him. I'm trying to think of anyone else. Cedric Johnson barely played. He was a 6th-round pick, and
none of the rookie free agents have a future on the team, you think?
No, Muma Njongmeta was one of their best special teamers. He was a linebacker, so he's going to be around. Ryan Rico, I guess, doesn't really count because he was signed in training camp, but he's technically a rookie DFA, and he's going to be the punter next year too. And Matt Lee was a 7th-round pick who didn't really play, but ended up earning a role as like one of the eligible blockers on like those jumbo packages. So that was interesting to see because he's like a small center and he's out there on the edge and kind of doing some reach blocking or whatever. But no, I think he's a solid player, but he's just not really going to have that many opportunities to play.
Are there, and before I let you go, are there any, we talked about the free agency before, are there any particular names out there that you can say that could be sort of like how, I like that name drop with Xavier Watts, now Golden. I'm going to use that one for sure. What about free agency? Are there any players out there that you can see that might be a really good fit with the Bengals for whatever reason?
I haven't really dug that far into it, to be honest with you.
Okay.
I think there's a defensive tackle from the Lions, Levi. I can't remember his last name. I don't know how to pronounce it, but he's like a fourth year player entering free agency for the first time, and I think he could be a potential value signing there. Like, again, I don't know how far they're going to splash into those waters outside of their own guys, because it's going to take a lot of money, obviously, with Chase, T, and Trey. So
Yeah.
you're looking at. You're not probably looking at any Orlando Brown, Trey Hendrickson type free agent signings this year. I think you're kind of staying in that mid-tier market to try to get as much value as possible.
Okay. And and I want Bengals fans, of course, or anybody who hasn't seen John's work, you can just check him out. We have links in the description to follow you. Do you do podcasts every day or just a few days a week?
Not every day. I couldn't do it every day. That's
I know. Some do, though. Some do. Yeah,
that's for the Locked On boys, and they do great work. But
yes.
I do a podcast with Anthony Kazinsa, the Orange Black Insider Bengals podcast, which you can find on the Believe Podcast Network. I also do a YouTube show for A to Z Sports, A to Z Sports Cincinnati. We do a handful of YouTube videos a week, and all the written work is on a2zsports.com/Cincinnati.
Awesome. John, I appreciate it. I look forward to talking to you again after the draft, unless there's some blockbuster story or something that goes on here between now and then. And I always appreciate your time.
Sounds good, Greg. Thank you.
You got it.